Welcome to the Lead Church Security YouTube channel, your ultimate guide to creating a safe and inviting church environment. The safety of our congregations can no longer be taken for granted. In years gone by, people had reverence for the church, but that reverence has been replaced with disdain in a lot of social circles. Church security can feel overwhelming. It's like there are so many new skills, there's so many tools that you need to obtain. The last thing a volunteer or an underpaid church staffer needs is added overwhelm and added anxiety. I say all of that to say this channel is designed and dedicated to empowering you, the church leader, with the tools, the strategies, and the insights that are needed to build a sturdy church security department. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel today if you haven't already, and let us guide you through creating a safer place for worship, fellowship, and community. Today, I want to talk about predictions. When we predict something, it means we're estimating that a specified thing will happen in the future, or a specified thing will be a consequence of another. We make predictions all the time. Predictions about the weather. We make predictions about the outcomes of a football game or a boxing match. If we want to predict whether or not a catastrophic event could take place at our church, we should look at cases where events took place at other churches. We should look at cases where kids were taken from their classrooms, or where someone collapsed due to cardiac arrest and they weren't able to recover. We should look at cases where children were violated and their predators went unnoticed. We should even cross that digital line and look at cases where cyber attacks were completed and churches were crippled financially. Then we need to ask ourselves why that was able to be done. Armed with that information, we need to make adjustments to our security measures. People only invest time and resources into making predictions when they believe two outcomes are possible. If you want to be the most proficient at predicting outcomes and establishing a better security plan for your church, you have to come to grips with the idea that multiple outcomes are possible. That means you have to come to grips with the idea that your church could be a target for an active shooter, or for a child abduction, or for other crimes that are against children. When we understand we are potential targets on one level or another, we put more time and effort into predicting those outcomes. Prediction isn't a science, it's an art. And when we realize pre-event indicators are part of a catastrophic event, we get to look like Michelangelo. Too often, we look at individual links when we should be looking at entire chains. The violent attack is just one link. The fire at your church seems like the event, but there were lots of links before the first sign of smoke. You might not know it, but our communities rely on us investigating some threats with credibility while discounting others. See, threats aren't the issue here. Threats coupled with context are the issue. That's why you can stay safely in a loving marriage after your spouse threatens to kill you for being late. You know your spouse loves you and has never given you a reason to believe otherwise. However, you're not going to park in that no parking zone because you believe you will either get a ticket or you're going to get towed away. It's going to make your night very difficult. See, context matters. Now, some of us fail to vocalize our predictions that are prompted by pre-event indicators. Why? Because we're afraid to be considered wrong, or especially in the church, we're afraid people are going to think we're making judgments about people without hard facts. In my opinion, a security director or a safety director is only wrong for these three reasons. One, you don't consider safety first. Two, you don't ask the right questions, which we're going to get to in just a minute. Or third, you don't communicate safety concerns quickly and clearly. If someone ever claims to be able to predict people's behaviors anywhere close to 100% of the time, don't buy what they're selling. Prediction isn't a science, it's an art. You might get better as you practice it, but because no two people have the exact same experiences, we can never be completely positive in our assumptions or predictions. Now, we know predictions are better or more accurate when we have more information, which is why we use background checks. When we are essentially hiring volunteers to work in our areas of ministry, we are unknowingly or subconsciously making predictions on how they will behave with our people, including our children. Oftentimes, we use background checks to alleviate our liability when we should be using background checks as a resource to help us make more clear predictions on how our prospective volunteers or even prospective staff members will interact with our members and attendees. But we have to go beyond background checks, guys. If we want to make clear predictions about people's behaviors, we have to go beyond background checks. We need to go a step further and employ stricter vetting processes, including asking for personal references and requiring an interview with a staff member who is trained to identify yellow flags or signs of asocial behavior. When an exhausted church member is too anxious to fill a position, we often put our intuition on mute. We allow wolves in sheep's clothing to creep into the flock. It's my opinion, if we want to create a safe environment at our churches, we have to learn to make predictions about people we're employing or allowing to volunteer in our spaces. In this video, I'm going to give you a concise list of questions you can employ when interviewing prospective volunteers. You don't have to feel overwhelmed like you've got to come up with this entire list. I'm going to give you some questions that you can use so that you can employ this vetting process. All right, now do yourself a favor and don't make the interview feel like an interrogation. Don't even call it an interview. Just make the interview a part of your policy and tell your prospective volunteer, we would love you to get plugged into ministry. But first, we need you to fill out a background check form. We need you to fill out our volunteer application. And then we just need to talk about what you hope to get out of volunteering with our team. Before you have your conversation with your volunteer, give their references a quick call. The list of questions you should ask references should be based off of the questions you ask on your volunteer application. You could call a reference and ask them to tell you about their time spent with the applicant on the mission trip to Colombia. If the reference is unfamiliar about the trip, you've got a pretty good yellow flag. Still, it doesn't mean that it's a red flag. It doesn't necessarily disqualify them from ministry. If the trip was like 10 years ago, they might have just had a lapse in memory. But still, it's something that you're going to want to follow up and clear up. Now, I've got 7 questions to ask in an interview with your applicant. But remember, don't turn this into an interrogation. If you do, you're going to put so much distance between you and your prospect when what you should be doing is building a bridge between you and them. After all, the goal should be to do ministry together. That means you're going to be sharing the love of Jesus with this person. So you want to make sure you build a bridge and don't create distance. The first question could be, tell me about your best boss you ever had. You can follow up with, tell me about the worst boss you ever had. Now, these 2 questions are powerful inquiries that can uncover how people feel about managers, management in general, or just leadership in general. Does this prospect ridicule past employers? Does he take any personal responsibility for his part in separating with old employers? Next, you could have them tell you about a failure they had in their life and why it occurred. If he can describe something that he perceives as a failure, does he take responsibility for the failure, or does he transfer all that blame to everybody else? See, responsibility is a marker of maturity, but transference is a sign of childishness. The 4th question I have on this list is, tell me how your last pastor could have been more successful. Does your applicant list a bunch of things that he could have done better than his previous pastor? Are his comments constructive, or are they angry? If they're angry, you'll want to make a note of it. To follow up on that, you could ask if there's anything your previous pastor could have done to keep them at his church. If they list a bunch of unreasonable demands, like he could have made me the worship leader, he could have gotten rid of that youth pastor, that should be a yellow flag. We're just about to the end of this list. Number 6 is, how do you go about solving conflict? If they say things like, I just tell people how things need to be, or I just go straighten people up, you might need to indicate a yellow flag here. Another yellow flag answer would be, I usually don't say anything because nothing ever changes anyway. Here's the point. Conflict is unavoidable, but you need people on your teams who will be able to meet in the middle and give more weight to the mission of the ministry than they do to their fragile egos. Now, the last question I have on this list is simple, but it gives a ton of insight. Simply ask them who their best friend is and how would they describe that friendship. Believe it or not, there are plenty of people who can't come up with a single response to that question. If they give a name that isn't listed as a reference, ask them why they're not a reference. Then ask them if you can reach out to them as an additional reference. Not having a best friend isn't a disqualifier, especially as adults. But when you couple that response with some of the other responses, it could give you some valuable insights on how you can expect to lead them. Maybe they need a community. Maybe they're really lonely and they're likely to receive at least as much from being on your ministry team as they're going to give. And that's okay. Like it or not, we have an obligation to predict some of the behaviors of our volunteers that we're going to give approval to. We have to predict how people are going to interact with our kids, with our families, and with our team members as well. On a serious note, we also have an obligation to predict if someone could become violent without reasonable prompting. I know the news likes to spin active shooters as if they came out of nowhere, but almost no acts of violence are completely random. The real problem is people just weren't paying attention. People weren't making predictions. And if they were too nervous or too scared to let their predictions be known. So what do we do with all of this information? Write a policy. Make it your church's policy that you do background checks, but you don't stop there. It's our jobs to predict people's behaviors. And if we're going to do that effectively, we need more information. That more information comes from interviewing. I know that this might feel like a lot, but I want to encourage you. You can do this. I believe in you, but more importantly, the creator of the entire world believes in you. That's why he entrusted you with the position that you're in. Guys, thanks so much for watching this episode. If you found this video to be helpful, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content. Don't miss the insights and the strategies and the tools that we're giving to you through this YouTube channel. Drop a comment or even some additional interview questions you might have in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.